Hi, once again, I'm Dr. Michael Siciliano, and this is week 3 in the Sociology of Work and Technology, where we're going to talk about race and gender as techniques for the oppression of workers in a capitalist society. Last week we were talking about different ways by which workers are controlled by organizations. Particular techniques by which managers or capitalists organize work in order to capture or extract the most labor power from a worker, right? And we talked about some different ways that's done. Direct control, wherein like a manager is kind of directly overseeing workers. We talked about the division of labor, de-skilling, as in Harry Braverman's discussion of the separation of planning and execution, which is, sort of his take on strategic management or Taylorism. We also talked about bureaucratic rules and how those can kind of control workers. Recently, the term racial capitalism has entered public discussions, especially those concerned with anti-black racism in North America. The term racial capitalism, it's meant to highlight the centrality of race to capitalist exploitation. This point is most clearly made in Cedric Robinson's book, Black Marxism. Cedric Robinson was a professor of political science and black studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And he's a key theorist of racial capitalism and a historian of black political movements. He's the author of this book, Black Marxism, which I assigned an excerpt from, which highlights the Eurocentrism of critiques of capitalism up until that point. The history of capitalism is not simply a matter of class struggle between the working classes and ruling elites, though it is, of course, that as well, but that capitalism has always depended upon racialization in order to further exploit people for profit. This differs very clearly from classical Marxism as well as more liberal or mainstream labor histories, which tend to paint European enslavement of black people as a sort of irrational or pre-modern aberration. In contrast, Robinson puts forth a theory that posits racism as an intrinsic feature of capitalism. Thus, capitalism cannot exist without racism. And capitalism reproduces race as social structures. Though his argument is perhaps most closely aligned with the history of slavery in the United States, there's also a lot of evidence to support the generalization of this theory to other countries, especially those countries that Stuart Hall once called societies of conquest, or what we might now call settler colonialist societies. That includes Canada, the United States, South Africa, among many others. In each, race provides a means of super exploitation beyond and in interaction with class exploitation. So, for example, regardless of education, Asian, Black, and Indigenous Canadians earn less on average than white Canadians and have a more difficult time entering desirable occupations and desirable jobs. So, for example, regardless of education, Asian, Black, and Indigenous Canadians earn less on average than white Canadians and have a more difficult time entering desirable occupations and desirable jobs. In fact, it's common for companies to require heightened credentials from visible minorities, such as requiring a master's degree for visible minority job seekers while only requiring a BA or less for white job seekers. The same is true for immigrants who are visible minorities. Now, in the chapter that I assign, Robinson attempts to show how racialization of Irish workers in the UK provided for heightened exploitation by British capitalists during the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. Now, I assign this chapter because it offers kind of a very condensed version of the argument, while also demonstrates how race and ethnicity play a crucial role in structuring work. In fact, sowing division and working to maintain that division aids in the exploitation of all and the super exploitation of the racialized group. Now, I just want to take a second to note that our current conceptualization of race as separate and distinct from ethnicity is really rooted in like the early to mid 20th century, as our ideas like our current understanding of like whiteness as a thing. These kind of terms, at least as we use them today, didn't really exist prior to the 20th century. Prior to that, what we would call today ethnicity was commonly called race. So, for example, in Europe in like the 19th century, you might have heard people speaking of like the Italian race or the German race, or in the case of the reading, the Irish race, right? And that's very different than I think our understanding. But I think that conflation, right, helps illustrate a similar social process, and this is kind of like Robinson's argument. I just assign kind of excerpts from these books, but if it's something that really grabs you or you find really interesting, that's the joy of the library. You can go and read on your own, right, and really dig in. Really sink your teeth into some of these ideas. So what we're seeing in this chapter that I assigned from Robinson's book is that despite potential alliances between members of the same class, the working class, we see division within the classes along ethnic lines. And this racialization of the Irish in the UK served two purposes. First, it allowed capitalists to pay the Irish much less than English workers. And second, it allowed the lowest English workers to feel superior in their exploitation relative to the exploitation of Irish workers. The creation of this ethnic underclass aided in the growth of British industry and the diffusing of potential alliances in radical social movements. This is something that's described in the text. You'll remember that there were actually these quite left-aligned alliances between workers of these differing ethnicities that were kind of thwarted as this ethnic cleavage was kind of fostered, right, and celebrated. So rather than creating a singular working class, this is what's put forth by theories, of capitalism, from Marx, for example. Robinson finds that when you actually look at the history as it was lived, he finds that I'm quoting from Robinson, the dialectic of proletarianization disciplined the working classes to the importance of distinctions, right? Rather than making them all one thing, which is kind of like what Marx theorized might happen under capitalism. It actually sowed divisions and made people heightened in their awareness of those distinctions, those divisions. So it disciplined the working classes to the importance of distinctions between ethnics and nationalities, between skilled and unskilled workers. And as he shows later in the book, and as he says here, as we shall see later in more dramatic terms, between races. Indeed, in these most dramatic examples, Robinson shows in the book how Europeans actively sought to dehumanize, and I would say demonize, black people in order to exploit black labor in the most heightened form of exploitation, chattel slavery. As we learned last week, the goal of capitalists, right, or managers, is to extract the most labor power from workers for the least amount of pay, dehumanizing people, treating human beings as things to be exchanged, as an asset that also labors. Then that is, in a way, the most capitalist thing one can do. And as Robinson argues, this is a firmly modern phenomenon. And his comment here isn't wholly unlike Oliver Cox's previous statement that he made in the 1940s. Robinson's writing in the late 1970s, early 1980s. Cox, about 40 years earlier, had said that race ought best be thought of as akin to class, in that it serves the purpose of economic exploitation. This being the case, current research is beginning to focus on how organizations become associated with particular racial groups and how that reproduces inequality. That organizations might be racialized as white, as black, as Asian is a relatively new idea in sociology, one put forth most strongly by Victor Ray. So basically, much like organizations are gendered institutions, which is something we'll see in the next lecture, organizations are also racialized institutions. So it's not just that this happens in particular social circumstances, like the history of Irish workers or the history of the enslavement of Africans by Europeans. It's that then that also becomes kind of built in to the organizational structure, and also, the way that we interpret a particular organization. If that sounds interesting to you, I really recommend you check out Victor Ray's recent Harvard Business Review article. It's free online. You can, kind of go outside the course if you want. And it's on that subject, if you're interested in learning more. And with that, I conclude this lecture, and I'll see you in the next one this week, where we'll talk about gender roles as a means of controlling labor. See you then.